So last week when I was reading Vue.js up and running, a lot of the syntax was new because I'd never seen Vue.js before, but a lot of the concepts were very familiar, especially coming from an AngularJS background. And one of the features in Vue that I wanted to see if I could pull back into Angular 2 Plus was this concept of one-time binding. Now, one-time binding is the idea that you evaluate a variable once or a limited number of times, and then take that value out of the change detection tree. So to see this as an example, we have an ng for loop here, or a loop over a collection of friends, and I have two sets of these loops, right? In fact, if we just do a little Command D, you'll see that they're the same exact code. The first one is just kind of the vanilla control case, and then the second one here has this bind once, and because of this asterisk here, you can tell that this is a structural directive, meaning this is actually a template-based directive that is responsible for creating embedded views. And the bind once, in this case, is looking at a friend's value. Now, there's also a form here which allows me to accept new names and then add friends to the collection. And let's just take a quick look at how the add friend works. So there's two ways that the friend can be added to the friends collection. We can either push the value directly onto the end of the array, or we can create a new array that concatenates the old collection plus the new name. Now, because the bind once is monitoring that friends collection, what that means is if we push the value directly onto that collection, the bind once won't see that change and therefore will remain outside of the change detection tree. If, however, we create a new top-level friends reference, the bind once structural directive will see that change and will therefore pull this value into the change detection tree for a single evaluation. Now, to see how that change detection interacts with the rest of the page, I also have this log do check attribute here. And the log do check does nothing but exactly what it says. It logs the do check lifecycle hook. The log do check directive, you can see here, is that log do check attribute, and all it does is provide an ng do check lifecycle method where it logs whether or not it was evaluated. And this will be an indication of whether or not the change detection tree reached that part of the document fragment. So before we look at how the bind once works, let's just take a look at the application to see how this is all coming into fruition. So here's my normal list, here is my friends list. Another thing to notice is that I do have a click handler on the document, and I'm doing that just to trigger change detection. So what you can see is that these are all list A, which is the first list here. There is no list B nd do check, and that's because the bind once structural directive has pulled this list out of the change detection tree, and the change detections are not being triggered. If we scroll back to the very top, you will see that there is a single one because, again, the bind once will evaluate its inner template once and then remove that template from the change detection tree. Now, if I add a couple of people here, you can see that, of course, those show up in the the control list, but they are not showing up in the bind once list. And again, that's because the bind once has removed this template from the change detection tree, and therefore it's not picking up on those new friends. However, let's refresh and get just a blank list. If we use the immutable friends, where we're actually creating a new friends collection when we push that name, we're creating a concatenation between the old list and the new name. If we now do this, you can see that the names show up in both the first list and the second list. And in fact, we can see here that list B is receiving a single call for do check. Now notice that list A, this is actually firing a whole bunch of times, right? There's a lot of change detection happening. But list B only fires the one time that it sees a change in the friends collection, the top-level friends collection reference, pulls that template back into the change detection tree for a single evaluation, and then removes itself from the change detection. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that bind once is actually working. It's actually super simple. So the bind once, it's an attribute selector for our structural directive, but then that bind once also acts as an input binding. Now, this is essentially, let me see if I can get it on one screen here. This is the entirety of the logic for this component, for this structural directive. So it accepts the view container ref, and the template ref. The template ref is, of course, essentially this minus the bindOnce attribute. So when this structural directive is instantiated, it takes that template, it tells the Vue container ref, that kind of parent container, to create the embedded Vue, and then it immediately detaches that embedded Vue from the container, from the change detection tree. And that's why we're not seeing all of those nd do check logs for the second list. Now, because this is a structural directive that uses an attribute selector, we know that the ng on changes is going to fire at least once for the initialization of the bindOnce attribute property. But if we are watching a value, which again we don't have to do, this could have been just this on its own, in which case it would have evaluated the template once and then never again. But in this case, because we're watching a particular value, every time that top level value changes, the ng on changes lifecycle hook is going to be invoked, and we're going to tell the embedded Vue to detect changes, which is going to pull it into the change detection tree for a single evaluation, and then it's going to be removed from the change detection tree. So by detaching that embedded Vue, it gives us more granular control over when detection happens, and in this case it only happens when that top level value changes, which is why when we're using the immutable data approach, we get both the control list and the bindOnce list to evaluate. But of course now you'll see that as I click around, we're still only getting list A change detection, and that's because we only pulled that list B back into the change detection tree for the single evaluation, and it's no longer receiving change detection digests after that, until of course we change it again, and you'll see that it is pulled back into the change detection tree, and in fact the names show up again. So anyway, just a fun experiment, bringing a kind of Vue.js inspired bindOnce functionality back into Angular. And you know, Angular is super fast on its own. Again, with the sorry, words are failing me. With the input bindings and the pure pipes and the way it handles the unidirectional data flow, it's already super fast. So there's probably a good chance you don't even need the concept of bindOnce. But I do think it is an interesting exploration of how flexible the Angular template syntax is and how we can really build complex functionality and borrow from other frameworks in a way that is natively supported by the Angular framework. So anyway, I think that's a worthwhile exploration.